to give you an example, I was born in Hawaii, so I love the ocean, I love water. Even if we do not see any further additions to carbon in the atmosphere, which is obviously unrealistic, we are already almost certainly anticipating a 3-foot rise in the oceans. I suppose I should speak in meters here in Italy. I have to do a quick conversion, but
it's a lot.
You're looking at a meter at least in the rise of ocean levels, even if carbon did not increase. At the high end, it could be 10 feet or 16 feet. Now, a huge portion of the human population lives along the oceans. And so some of the world's major cities are along oceans. The amount of disruption that could occur just from ocean levels rising is enormous. If you think about monsoon patterns in the Indian subcontinent, maybe 500 million people rely on traditional rain patterns in those areas. If those rain patterns change, then you could see hundreds of millions of people who suddenly find themselves unable to feed themselves because they're already at subsistence levels. And the amount of migration, the number of refugees that could be resulting from something like that would be unprecedented in human history.
Right.
So it is almost certain that we will have some disruptions. The key for us now is to try to make sure that we keep those disruptions at the lower end of the estimates so that we can adapt to them.
Right.
And if the oceans go up 3 feet and temperatures go up a degree or 2, then we can manage. If not, then what we can anticipate is not only real threats to food security, but also increases in conflict as a consequence of scarcity, greater refugee and migration patterns. The strains that it's placed on the political system here in Europe, I think, would be just the beginning of the kinds of problems that we would see. And so this is something that we're going to have to take bold action on. The good news is that technology is actually moving in some ways faster than we had anticipated. Now, we're going to have some time to talk about food security because obviously there's a food conference, but just to give you a sense of how much progress we're making on the energy front, during my presidency, in part because of investments that we made, the United States increased its production of wind power threefold, by 3 times. We increased the production of solar power by 10 times.
Wow.
And the unit costs for electricity and power production using renewable energy and clean energy is now almost comparable to the costs of dirtier fuels like oil and gas. Now, there's still storage issues involved, so it's a less reliable system. We haven't built out the infrastructure yet, but it's moving in that direction. And the key for us is just to take some basic smart steps that don't require us to reduce our standard of living. And although it will require us to divert some resources to new technologies rather than old technologies, which means we're creating new jobs in these sectors rather than just hanging on to some of the old jobs that exist, it is possible for us to make real progress, steady progress, over the next 20 years. At some point, we'll still need some big technological breakthroughs in order to discover completely new ways of producing energy. If we buy ourselves the 20 or 30 years that we need, then human innovation, I think, will deliver what we need.
Yeah. So COP21 was, the agreement in Paris was an unprecedented moment of collective action globally. Right. Never anything like that's happened in the world. Are you optimistic that it's going to succeed? Do you think this was really the turning point? Do you think we'll look back and see this as a turning point where the world got serious and really solved this problem?
I think the key to the Paris Agreement is not that it solved climate change. The agreement did not set high enough standards to completely solve the problem of climate change, but what it did was put together the architecture, the mechanism where each year each country could progressively do more to reduce its carbon emissions. And as technology improved, you would steadily see a reduction in greenhouse gases. Now, I think it is important that big countries that are big emitters, like the United States and China, as well as Europe, we have to lead the way.
Yeah.
Because the challenge for climate change has always been that the emerging countries, poorer countries with large populations, they look and they say, those of you in the West, you developed yourselves using dirty energy, and now you are very wealthy, and each person in your country has this huge carbon footprint.
Right.
You all have big cars, and you have air conditioning, and you have electricity, and you lose all these electronics, and you are eating steaks every day.
Right.
And now you want to tell us that we should not develop because we need to save the planet. That's not fair.
Right.
And so what we've said is everybody has to do something.
Right.
But you are right that countries like the United States have to show leadership.
Right.
And the key to getting the Paris Agreement was the deal that I was able to make with President Xi, where China, the largest emerging country, and the United States, the largest advanced country, the two largest carbon emitters, came together and said, we're going to do something now.
Yeah.
That takes away the excuse for everybody else
right.
Who may not want to do something.
Yeah.
That's going to require, though, continuing leadership on all of our parts.
Yeah.
Nobody can sit on the sidelines if we want to deal with this issue in an effective way.
I'm just going to take this. Yes. I'm going to take this moment just because I can to just thank you for your leadership, because I don't think people saw a lot of the leadership that President Obama did to get this done. The COP21 agreement literally would not have happened if it weren't for your leadership. So thank you so much for all that you did. The United States has been sending some mixed signals, though, on where we are in terms of leadership on climate change. What's your message in terms of where you see the United States going in the future on these issues?
Well, look, obviously, the current administration has differences with my administration in terms of energy policy. And that's part of what happens in democracy.
Right.
So there will be a useful debate that takes place in America. The good news is that, in part because of what we did over the last 8 years, the private sector has already made a determination that our future is in clean energy. Investments are already moving into clean energy. Yeah. And automakers have already started thinking about how do we improve fuel efficiency. Those things are locked in now into the economy. So although because of the current debates that are taking place in Washington, it may be that some of the steps we put in place move more slowly than they otherwise would have. But I'm confident that the United States will continue to move in the right direction. I'll just give you one example for those of you who are not as familiar with the U.S. market. The Trump administration made a change. We had set some very aggressive standards for fuel efficiency in cars. Some of those the automakers adopted, but some of them were slated to take place in the future and were subject to change by the current White House. But here's the thing, California makes its own fuel emission standards, and California is the largest market for cars in the United States. So even if the rules change in Washington, there's no U.S. automaker that can afford to produce a car that is not fuel efficient enough to be sold in California. And so that's what I mean about how many of these issues are already being determined at the local level by business investors, by engineers who are making decisions now about planning for the future. And it makes sense from an economic point of view. There should be no company on earth that wants to waste energy, because energy costs money. And if you can find ways to be more energy efficient, that will reflect itself in their profits. And what we've tried to do is create market incentives that have unlocked some of the progress and innovation that needs to be made in the energy sector. And now, obviously, what this conference is representing is the same opportunity in the food sector. Because, as I noted in my remarks, although we've made real progress in becoming more efficient on the energy side, not as much as we need to, but we've become more efficient, we are actually seeing a continuing increase in the emissions that are coming out of the agricultural sector. And a lot of that has to do with changing diets around the world. As people want to increase meat consumption, that in turn is spiking the growth of greenhouse emissions coming out of the agricultural sector. This offers a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs, businesses, scientists, thought leaders to make progress in an area where we have not made as much progress as we can.
So let's talk about that for a second. So when I look at the food system, it's fundamentally it's one of the most inefficient systems of the great human systems, right? We're depleting our soil, and our water tables, our aquifers globally are running very low. The two big foundation of how we eat. It's the second leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions, as you discussed, which is making it harder for us to grow food. We're wasting a third globally of what we produce in terms of resources. That's just incomprehensible amount of inefficient. You could never imagine like a gas company wasting a third of what they're pulling out of the ground, right? And the outcomes we're getting, on the one hand, say in the United States, for example, a third of our children on track to have diabetes. It's the #1 cause of preventable death and disease is related to food. And globally, we still see massive amounts of malnutrition and hunger. So that, for me, just says giant inefficiencies that we can solve for. So we'll get to a few of those pieces. But I was at COP21 trying to get food to be a little in food and agriculture to have a lot of voice. But like pretty traditionally, the vast majority of what I heard was about energy. Very little about food. Why do you think food hasn't been a bigger part of the focus when it comes to climate?
Well, part of it is that we haven't publicized in the past the impact of food production on greenhouse gas emissions. So I think people naturally understand that big smokestacks have pollution in them, and
Right.
they understand air pollution. They can easily make the connection between energy production and the idea of greenhouse gases. People aren't as familiar with the impact of cows,
Right.
right, and methane. I mean, that's unless you're a farmer, and then you know what takes place there. So some of it is just lack of knowledge in the general public. Now, keep in mind, it took a long time to educate people around climate change, and we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
So part of it is education. Part of it is that food is a very emotional issue, especially here in Milan, right? I mean, food's important.
Yeah.
I should point out that before I came here, I actually went to see Da Vinci's The Last Supper. Just so even in our religion and in our art, food is important, and so because food is so close to us and is part of our families and it's part of what we do every single day.
Yeah.
People, I think, are more resistant to the idea of government or bureaucrats telling us how to eat, what to eat, how to grow, etc. Right? So some of it is, I think, that resistance. The truth is that the agricultural communities in every country are very strong politically. Historically, in the United States, the one area where Democrats and Republicans agree is on the Agriculture Committee, because they usually come from agricultural states, and they're very good at joining across party lines to protect the interests of food producers.
Yeah.
So if you combine all those things with the fact that the system is so uneven, there are countries that just need more food and need more calories, and there are countries where there's a glut of food. It makes for a difficult political dynamic in us being able to shape rational policy. Now, having said that, I think that this is an area where we are starting to see some progress. In the United States, through our agricultural department, one of the things that we tried to do is to work with farmers to think about how they could produce the same amounts of food more efficiently with fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And what I've always said is that if you want to make progress in this area, you have to take into account the interests of the producers themselves, because farmers work hard. I don't care what country they're from. It's hard work. And especially if you have small farms, family farms, they feel that they're always just a step away from losing the farm.
Yeah.
Obviously, a large portion of agriculture is dominated by large agribusiness, but I think that to the extent that you can show small and medium-sized farmers ways to do things better that will save them money, or at least doesn't cost them money, they're happy to adopt some of these new processes and new systems. But if what they see is that you are putting the environmental issues as a priority over their economic interests, then they'll resist.
Right.
And that's true in advanced countries. It's also true in poor countries. You know, my father's from Kenya. The first time I visited, I was speaking to some conservationists who were very upset because some of the game parks were being encroached upon by either the Maasai with their cattle,
Right.
or by subsistence farmers who were slashing and cutting down the ecosystem. And my sister, who's from Kenya and I think has a less romantic view about animals and game parks, she said, well, if all the money of the game parks is going to the tour agencies in Nairobi and not going to the farmers right next door, then of course they're not going to care. But if they see some incentive, some economic interest in helping to conserve this land,
Yeah.
then they'll participate. And that,
Right.
in fact, has been the case where you've seen success in conservation. It's because you brought in the local farmers,
Right.
and you taught them how this is better for them.
Yeah.
So that, I think, has to be a top priority. If we're going to be successful, we have to engage producers. We also have to engage consumers.
Yeah, that's where I was just about to go. Because we do hear a lot about climate-smart agriculture, sustainable agriculture. But in the end, farmers are growing food to feed people.
Right.
And it's a very interwoven system. And I think you have to really start talking about climate-smart eating if we're really going to unlock that potential. So the biggest driver in emissions from ag is beef. Now, you and I love a steak. I've cooked you thousands of steaks. Probably.
Well, I don't know about thousands.
Well, hundreds maybe. I've been cooking for you for 10 years. Hundreds of steaks.
I'm trying to count. I don't think there are thousands, but
It's been a long time.
But what is true is I am not a vegetarian.
Yes.
I respect vegetarians, but I'm not one.
Yeah.
I'm not one of them.
Yeah, neither am I.
No.
But do you think that has to be a part of the solution? Is changing, what we're actually eating, just not how we're growing it?
Well, for those of you who are not familiar, Sam worked with my wife to promote healthy eating, and most of the impact that you had was not legislation. It wasn't laws that were passed, but it was just raising awareness with parents about what unhealthy eating was doing to their children. And I think the key from a consumer perspective is just giving people good information.
Yeah.
Now, the challenge we have is that, I lived in Indonesia when I was young, and in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Africa, currently meat consumption is so low in a lot of communities that the gap between meat consumption there and in the United States, for example, is as much as the energy use in those countries per capita and what it is in the United States. So no matter what, we are going to see an increase in meat consumption.
Right.
Just by virtue of more Indians, Chinese, Vietnamese, and others moving into middle-income territory. That doesn't mean that we can't teach, you and me to have a smaller steak for our own health. It doesn't mean that we can't make progress in educating the advanced world about the need to reduce, just for dietary reasons, the amount of meat that we can consume at any given meal, particularly if it's wasted.
Yeah.
But what it does mean is that we're also going to have to find ways to produce protein in a more efficient way, and that's where some of the technologies that come in at this conference, I think, will be really, really important.
Yeah. So just you just mentioned it briefly to touch on it before we move on to sort of health and technology. We do waste an insane amount of food. In the United States, it's 40%. The average American family is throwing away $1,500. The average family. So that's a lot of money for them. Do you think this is just endemic to who we are in the Western world to waste this kind of food, or do you think this is something we can make some real progress on?
No, I think we can make progress, but part of waste has to do with commerce and how things are packaged and how things are sold.
Yeah.
And I think an area where technology and innovation can make a huge amount of progress is in the equivalent of what happened in manufacturing, where you just have smaller inventories, so you wait until you need the part before you use it and you don't have to store as much. The same is true, I think, in food. Part of the problem is that people don't feel as if they have the time or the ability to buy the right size of a meal every single day, so they get prepackaged stuff that gets cooked in bulk, or it comes in a certain volume. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is when you have, so this is not just billions of dollars, this is tens, hundreds of billions of dollars that we are spending, and U.S. companies are spending because we don't have a government-based healthcare system, that they're wasting essentially because people are getting sick from preventable diseases. So the more we can do to educate people on healthy eating, just like no longer smoking, and I say that as somebody who's a former smoker. Michelle beat me over the head for years until I finally stopped. If you can prevent diseases, that obviously saves a lot of money in the healthcare system. That's the place to start. You are right that during my time in office, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is this idea of personalized medicine. Because of us cracking the human genome, we are at the very early stages of a revolution in medicine where instead of everybody taking the same pill for a disease, we're going to be able to identify that actually you need this particular pill with this particular dose, and what I need is going to be different than what you need. We're going to be able to anticipate what kinds of tendencies you have, what diseases are you prone to. We're more likely to find that certain foods, for example, trigger certain problems for certain people. The easiest example is allergies, where one of my daughters has a peanut allergy, but she's now going through a process at Stanford University where she's being evaluated for each nut, the kind of allergy she has, how bad it is, and they're able now to determine protocols whereby if she takes a little bit of nut protein in a pill each day, slowly her allergy is eliminated. And so those kinds of precise diagnoses are going to be taking place.
It's working too.
All across medicine. Now, I think that how that translates into people's eating habits, we don't yet know, because a lot of people eat not just for health, we eat because it tastes good. I was at a dinner last night, and I can't say that all the desserts that were served were good for me. Even if you had told me that this is not good, I think I still would have eaten them because they were very good. They were delicious. So, we don't want to create a society in which, you can only eat things that are good for you.
Who wants that?
Yeah, I mean, once in a while you should be able to just eat because it tastes good. But I do think that at least each individual is going to have more information about their own their own tendencies and to be able to optimize what's best for them. And that's a huge area for innovation and over time improved health, and ultimately cost savings because people are getting sick less.
Yeah, you just said something that I think is really important, especially for the entrepreneurs here, which is that if it doesn't taste good, it's not a future that any of us want, number one, or that I think is going to work. I mean, if it's not, if we don't have a delicious future, what's the point of this, right? So I think that's a critical point. So before we get to the technology part, just one last question on health. Watching your wife, Michelle, do her thing and have her impact, what did you learn from her as you watch her go about her business? Because she's just been one of the most effective leaders any of us have ever seen.
Well, I think that Michelle's success was because she came at the problem as a parent rather than a policymaker. And she had a very good sense of how a mother thinks about feeding her children.
Right.
And she wants to make sure her children are healthy, but she also knows that she's busy, and she knew that she needed something that was quick and convenient and that the girls actually would eat.
Challenge right there.
And so I think she came at it from a very practical perspective. And I guess that goes to the point you were making earlier about food and that you just re-emphasized. People want joy from food. Yeah. There's some elite athletes who they eat just as fuel. And, they're taking, I need 5,000 calories, and so they just get boiled eggs and, soy milk, and that's all they eat all day long. But that's not how most people are going to think about food, because it's a social and a cultural, glue that we depend on. So that, I think Michelle's strength was thinking in those practical terms. Yeah. And I think in the area of food in particular, maybe more than energy, it is important to attract people with something positive rather than try to penalize them with something negative. Yeah. Because I think the average person is not going to be happy if the government is telling them what they are eating or what they're drinking or how they're supposed to live in something that is very personal and very intimate to them.
Yeah. All right, to focus a little more on technology for a minute. You walk around the floor, there's just amazing innovation happening, all from agriculture and precision agriculture all the way through to consumer products, goods, and smart kitchens and all kinds of stuff. I think one of the emerging technologies that, from my vantage point, holds the biggest potential to transform how we eat is gene editing. Not GMOs exactly. It's actually, manipulating the current genome of seed to enhance nutrition, reduce water needs, all these, and it's cheap and easy, and now could affect everything we eat. What are your thoughts on that technology? Are these the kind of tools that are going to be vital to solve these problems, or do you think what we have now is enough? Because people are just starting to wrap their heads around these kind of emerging technologies.
This debate around genetically modified foods is, I know, a very controversial one. The approach that I took when I was President of the United States is in the same way that I would let the science determine my policies around climate change. I try to let the science determine my attitudes about food production and new technologies. And precisely because, as I said before, people are very sensitive about food and what they're feeding their families, I think it's okay for us to be cautious about how we approach these new technologies and genetic modifications. But I don't think we can be closed off to it. I don't think we can be closed-minded to it. The truth is that humanity has always engaged in genetic modifications. Right? The rice we eat or the corn we eat or the wheat we eat does not look like what corn or wheat or rice looked like 1,000 years ago. And that's because humanity continually learned from experience, and once the scientific revolution took place and the Renaissance took place, we started realizing that we could not just discover things by accident, but actually put in place systems of discovery and the scientific method. So we can't stop now in discovering new things. I do think we have to have some safeguards in how we approach it. Part of what Sam was referring to is the technologies around gene editing, gene splicing, all those mechanisms to change the fundamental ways in which life organizes itself. That's advancing very quickly, and it's very cheap. The barriers to entry are not as high as they used to be.
Yeah.
And so thinking about how we do this in the food context in an appropriate way, in a controlled way, to make sure that we get the benefits without the unintended consequences, that is an appropriate area for policymakers to examine and work with industry and work with science to figure out.
Yeah.
But I don't think that we can just cut it all off.
Yeah.
And the GMO debate here in Europe, I worry a little bit that sometimes the conversation has just gotten cut off, as opposed to let's see what the facts are. But again, you understand where the distrust comes from. There was a time when the tobacco industry assured us that cigarettes were great for you.
Right.
And there have been times where pharmaceutical companies said that something wasn't harmful, and then it turned out that they had been doctoring and manipulating the data, and people were severely harmed. So, and when it comes to genetic modifications, what we also have to look at is how is it going to impact in the broader environment. But it's here, it's going to come anyway.
Yeah.
So we might as well make sure that we have a smart discussion about how we proceed, how we think about it.
And I think part of the reason why unhealthy food is cheaper than healthier food is all the innovation and investment in research for decades, right? Which has led to huge efficiencies and increased yields per acre, where in fruits and vegetables, it's pennies compared. The other, I think, big transformation was the mechanization of the farm, particularly for large commodity crops. Now you can plant thousands of acres, water them, and harvest them, and there doesn't have to be a farmer anywhere near that. And those technologies really are still at its infancy. I mean, they're going to get better and better. As we start to see possibilities to bring those technologies to fruits and vegetables, for example, which right now are very labor-intensive, meaning a lot of people are employed to do that. That's why the prices are higher. How do you, and this is a tension that's playing out throughout our entire society, where technology is just replacing jobs. How do you balance those in your thinking? How should we be thinking about jobs and then efficiencies around health and wellness for fruit and vegetables?
Well, let me divide up the question. First of all, in everything we've been talking about today, the issue of inequality, both within countries and between countries, is absolutely critical. If we do not pay attention to the increasing inequality that exists, and that technology and globalization is accelerating, then there will be a backlash and a resistance to technology and change and globalization because people will feel left behind. And that is true across the board. If people feel as if they don't have control over their lives, their children don't have a good future, then they will resist efforts to deal with climate change, because right now I'm concerned about feeding my child. It's a luxury to worry about climate change. You have to be able to have enough to eat before you start worrying about what's going to happen to the planet 30 years from now. When it comes to healthcare, what we just described about personalized medicine, if we start getting to a point where the very wealthy are living 10 years or 15 or 20 years longer than poor people in the same country because they can't afford those same technologies, you will see massive disruptions through the political system because people will find that completely unjust, and they will be right. So we can't ignore making sure that everybody has some ability to access the wonders of this new world. So that's point number one. Point number two is that technology across the board is making many sectors of the economy far more capital intensive, far less labor intensive. We saw it in manufacturing, but it is now moving through the large portions of the service and managerial sectors as well. This is going to be a major problem in the advanced world and over the long term in the developing world as well. It's one of the things I worry about most, and that is the nature of work. Because what work does is it does not just provide income, it also provides people a sense of dignity and status in their society. I'm certain that in many countries in the Middle East, for example, or in South Asia, part of the problem that leads to radicalization and conflict and terrorism is if you have just large numbers of unemployed young men, even if they have enough to eat but they have nothing to do, then that lack of meaning and purpose will channel itself in unhealthy ways. So this is something that we're all going to have to worry about. One of the debates, the best example that we've been using recently in this discussion is the whole issue of a driverless car. Now, driverless cars are coming. The technologies are here. Eventually, the regulatory barriers are going to break down. And the truth is that we can create a system of driverless cars that are safer, result in fewer accidents, are more fuel efficient, so the energy savings in the transportation sector are massive, are more convenient. But in the United States alone, there are 3 million people or 4 million people who make good livings just driving. And where are they going to work if suddenly trucking, buses, all this no longer needs a driver? We have to anticipate those things now. But I guess my point is that when it comes to how that applies to the sector, the food sector, as it is in the United States, only 2% of people are involved in agriculture anyway. So I don't think that the displacements in agriculture are going to be massive. We'll have to deal with, particular communities or particular types of agricultural workers who may need different experiences or different training in order to find new jobs. But this is a much bigger concern in the economy as a whole. And my guess is that ultimately what is going to happen is that everybody's going to have to work a little bit less, and we're going to have to spread work more. But that's going to require a reorganization of the social compact. That requires that we change our mindset about the link between work, income, the value of people in the teaching profession or in healthcare, or certain things that cannot be done by AI or a robot.
Right.
And one of my goals as president, not entirely successful, but I think one of the goals of every leader of every country right now is thinking about that time 20 years from now or 30 years from now where technology will have eliminated entire sectors of the economy.
Right.
How do we prepare for that, and how do we start creating, or at least having a conversation in our society about making sure that work and opportunities are spread, and that everybody has the chance to live a good and fulfilling life, rather than having a few people who are working 80 or 90 hours a week and making enormous incomes, and then a large portion of redundant workers that that increasingly have a difficult time supporting families. That's not a sustainable mechanism for democracy and a healthy society.
Yeah. One last technology question and a couple final questions. Privacy is just a giant concern. I know a lot of the businesses that are here innovating are founded on data collection. Personalized medicine is really understanding the data of people. And I think the more data and understanding we have, the better services we're going to be able to provide. Right. How should we as young entrepreneurs or investors be thinking about the tension between protecting people's privacy, but also using that kind of information to transform people's health for the better, transform their food, and so on?
Well, one of the biggest struggles that I had during my presidency was trying to just keep the policy up to speed with the changes that were happening in cyber computing, social media. It's moving so fast, and laws just don't move as fast as the technology is moving.
Yeah.
The amount of power that now resides in private companies that are collecting data is enormous.
Yes.
And people want government to protect their privacy, but they're also suspicious of government intruding on their privacy. And companies are resistant to giving up data, particularly if they can commercialize it. It's useful for them to be able to sell more stuff to their customers. So it's a difficult problem. I think the most important thing here is the consumer. Mm-hmm. And if, as a consumer, I know that you are collecting my data and I know what it's being used for, then I can choose to participate or not participate in whatever service or product you're providing. If I don't know, and then you're selling it to somebody else and I'm getting a whole bunch of advertising coming over my phone, then that's different. And so I think that at a minimum, the baseline has to be consent and consumer awareness. Yeah. And I think a lot of companies don't always do as good of a job as they need to be doing in making sure that people understand how their data is being used. But you're absolutely right that this is going to be more and more relevant because companies are collecting more and more data. And from a government perspective, it's going to put pressure on a lot of governments because, as I said before, if you want government to help police and prevent bad actors from stealing your data, hacking into your bank accounts, etc., then that means that the government has some capacity to do things within the cyber world. And if you don't trust the government with that capacity, then it's hard for them to do their jobs. And what we've tried to do is create partnerships with the private sector, provide guidelines, but again, as much as possible, make sure that consumers are the most important check on how companies use their data. And I think it's important as we move forward for people to feel as if they do own their data. In this whole issue of medicine, one of the big debates is who owns the data? Right now, many research facilities, hospitals, they will take samples and data from patients, use them without necessarily the patients understanding exactly how their data is being used. And so we've been developing laws over the last several years in the United States about what it means to own data, and it's going to be more important when, for example, we start wanting to get genetic samples from a wide range of folks to determine what kinds of diseases are responsive to certain types of treatments. Our ability to participate in those studies, but do it knowingly, saying I'm giving my data freely because I know that this is going to be used properly. Creating structures to do that, I think, is going to be very important.
Okay, we could sit here and do this all day. Last couple questions. You started your trajectory as a community organizer, advocating on behalf of people trying to make change. And then as you worked your way up from state senate to president, you've been on the receiving end of a lot of advocacy. Talk to me about what effective advocacy looks like. What are some of the mistakes that advocates make that actually have made it harder for you to achieve the goals that you're trying to do, that they're pushing for?
Well, we have an expression in the United States, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So it's certainly true that politicians and governments respond to people making some noise and making demands, and sometimes if certain groups have not been heard before, they have to get the attention of those in power. But I think the biggest mistake sometimes that is made by activists, and when I was an activist, sometimes I made this mistake, is once you've gotten the attention of people in power, then you have to engage them and have sensible ideas for what we're going to do about the problem that you've identified. So you've got to do your homework, and you have to have facts. And you have to be willing to compromise and not expect that you're going to get 100% of what you want, because at least if you're in a democracy, then your demands may clash with the demands of someone else. And so I think it's very important to be willing to put pressure on government and government officials and draw attention to issues, but it's also important to have concrete solutions that you're proposing, and to be able to take half a loaf if you can't get a whole loaf, and then try to make more progress after that. The second thing that I think is increasingly important is how to shape public opinion. What's changed most drastically in I think, government and politics and social movements over the last 20, 30 years is just the nature of the internet and social media and how fast it moves.
Right.
And some of it is very good and some of it's not very good. It is very important, I think, for progressives and people who are interested in issues like climate change or inequality or the environment or whatever it is that you care about, to find effective ways to speak to the public and to change public opinion.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln used to say that with public opinion, there's nothing I cannot do, and without public opinion, there's nothing I can do. And I've learned that firsthand myself. Shaping public opinion in this internet age, finding ways in particular to speak to young people who are getting all their information off a phone and will not, sit down and read a 50-page report. You may have 2 minutes to get your message across.
Yeah.
Or 5 minutes. And they may be more interested in a video than they are in reading a text. And you being able to create a strong, truthful, powerful message that leads them to action.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be something that I'm going to be spending a lot of time thinking about. It was important in my campaigns. I would not have gotten elected without harnessing the power of the internet back in 2008. But what we were doing back then compared to what's happening now, it was like we were using the telegraph.
Yeah. It's like the Stone Age.
It was like, we were beating a drum.
But I think a lot of the keys to that is how you tell your story, right? I mean, a lot of times we try to advocate only facts and cerebrally.
As opposed to emotions.
But talking to people's hearts is really the way I've found to be most effective in getting people to change.
I completely agree with that.
Okay. When being in government for 6 years, serving with you and the First Lady, although immense power, you actually feel all the constraints of government and how, particularly on issues of food, there's only so much that the government actually controls. In the end, this is a private endeavor.
Right.
Farmers are business people, truckers are business people, and down the line. And what is the role for the private sector? And when you see the young entrepreneurs coming, what's different about them? And do you see a change in that mentality from a business perspective?
Well, look, I think, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, young people are more conscious today. They're more innovative. They're more entrepreneurial. Because they're more skeptical of government and politics, Matteo and I are exceptions. It seems as if a lot of people think, that's a dirty business. I don't want to go into it. Who wants to be, criticized and attacked all the time? And so I think you're seeing a lot of people who want to change the world think maybe going into business or a non-profit organization is the better way to do it. I think we need good contributions from all these sectors. If I were an entrepreneur today, trying to make money and sell my products or services, I think it is worth understanding, though, this youth market. They want to do the right thing too.
Right.
So if they find out that what you're selling isn't good for the environment, or what you're selling is not good for people, or if they hear that you do not treat your workers well and do not pay them a decent wage and don't provide decent benefits, that can affect your brand. And so part of what's changed is the nature of the entrepreneurs themselves, who may be more socially conscious coming into their business.
Right.
But part of what's changed is even if you don't care about these issues, your customers care.
Yeah.
And you've got to be paying attention to that.
That gives me a lot of hope.
It should make you hopeful.
Yeah.
I noticed that
we have a couple
two questions on the screen, and then
do.
I've got to go home and have dinner with my family.
Yes.
So.
All right. So we
right,
have.
so
they're kind of the same.
I don't know what's for dinner though tonight.
Hey, you're on your own, man. I can't help you there. I'm staying here and having dinner here tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not stupid. Okay. Food for all from Joshua, age 13, from Italy. He asked, and I'm going to ask the question 1 and question 2 because they're similar. I often hear about people not having enough to eat, and it makes me feel really bad. What can I, as a 13-year-old, do to make changes that will help bring food to everyone? And Cole and Parker, age 7, they're from Idaho, but have spent a lot of time here. They're asking about feeding the planet. President Obama, we are so excited to be with you here. We're only 7 years old. What can we do to help feed the planet? And we love you.
See there, so you can see that these young people, they're already thinking about how they can do some good. Well, Cole, Parker, Joshua, I think the most important thing you can do right now at your age is to act locally. Wherever you live, I guarantee you that there's some hungry people there. And for you to talk to your parents or talk to your school and to start organizing some program to help feed people who are hungry and in need, that's something that you can do even when you're 7 years old, and you can make a real difference. The effect that you can have on your schoolmates and your friends and your parents when they see that you care, you'll be, no matter how young you are, already making an impact just in your local community. Yeah. I think long term, the biggest thing we can do to help feed more people around the world goes back to the old saying that instead of giving someone a fish, teach them how to fish. I was speaking to the former mayor about the work she's doing with African entrepreneurs. One of the things that we did with our food security program in Africa is really just focus on how do we empower small farmers to think more like entrepreneurs. How can we just provide them small capital loans or give them better market information or have them move a little bit up the value chain just so that they can make a little bit more money, create more yields, and if you see increased incomes for the 7 million or so farmers that we helped the first few years that we did this, you're now creating a new middle class in those countries, and they in turn then will start employing more people. Yeah. And that in turn will create more food production. There are emergency situations in places like Somalia or Ethiopia at any given time where we just have to get food there to save people right now. But I think in the developing world, the most important thing we can do is to teach people how to be self-sufficient. The other thing that we're going to have to do is to make sure that we don't burn up the planet, because there's no point in us having made all this progress in teaching people how to grow more food for themselves, but then suddenly weather patterns are so severe that everything that they learned, everything that they invested their time and energy and hopes in, suddenly are destroyed. And that's going to require the involvement of everybody. So Cole and Parker and Joshua, the other thing you're going to have to do is make sure you talk to your parents about turning off the lights when you go into rooms and making sure you're not wasting energy at home and food. Turn down the air conditioning if it's making things too cold inside your house. But it's the spirits of young people like these three that make me convinced, even if sometimes things don't go exactly as we want or the world seems as if it's moving in the wrong direction. It reminds me that history never moves in a straight line. Over time, it moves in the direction of justice.
Yeah.
All right?
Well, listen, thank you. Thank you for joining us. It means a lot to me and everybody who cares about this. Thank you, President Obama.
Good.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thank you.
All right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Milan. Thank you, Milano. Grazie.
Yeah, you come.